Hi everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with a very simple scene card using the Rhino Bird Day stamp set by Trinity Stamps. I'm starting off with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and this is cut down to just slightly smaller than an A2 size card. And I'm just going to start by kind of arranging some of the stamps from the set to kind of just get an idea of where I want them to be placed before I start stamping them. Now I will be doing just a little bit of masking, but I'm pretty much going to be doing my ink blending directly over most of my images, kind of keep it nice and simple. So I am going to start by stamping my little rhinos here, and there's three in the stamp set, but I'm going to be using two of them here. And there's several little birds that you can use, and I'm going to be using two of those as well. One is going to be on the ground, kind of looking up at one of the rhinos, and the other will be on top of one of the rhinos' head, and he's going to be holding some balloons. So the balloon stamp, I'm going to stamp one of those down first, mask that out, and I'm using Simon Says Stamp masking paper, but you can really use anything. And then I'll stamp another, mask that out, and then finally stamp my third one. I was trying to avoid doing any masking at all, but I had to do a little. So I'll draw in my little balloon strings later, and you'll just want to make sure that you do this with a Copic Safe pen if you are using Copics anywhere around it. I'm going to add some little party hats to my little bird as well as the other rhino. Hat that I picked is a little bit bigger than it should have been for that bird, but that's okay. I did mask the rhinos just because I knew I wanted them to be a lighter gray color, and I didn't want the color that I'm going to be using with the Distress inks to show through there. So once I had my masks down, and I did rip his little ear off, so I had to kind of maneuver to get that one back down. I did remove the masks for the balloons because these would normally be transparent anyway, that I didn't mind the Distress ink showing through where I planned on coloring them. I took a EK Success journaling pen and drew in my strings, but I did that after. So first I did my ink blending, and I'm using one of the blendability brushes here. And for the bottom part, I am using peeled paint, and I'm sorry if you guys can hear that, but my phone is ringing. Um, and for the top, probably should have grabbed another brush, but I'm being pretty lazy here. I'm working on about 3 hours of sleep after traveling for nearly 24 hours yesterday. So I'm a little out of it, but you can see some of that green shining through. And this is broken china, regular distress ink, because I knew I was going to be coloring over them. So some of that green was showing through the top part of my sky. So I wasn't liking the way it was looking. You could see the blue, but it definitely kind of gave it like a muddy look because I was lazy. So I'm going to bring in another color of the distress ink, and this is the peacock feathers. And I'm just going to kind of brighten up my sky a little bit. I wanted it originally to be kind of subtle, but you guys know that your plan for a card 99% of the time doesn't necessarily come out the way you planned it. So I didn't do any masking for the background. I kind of just let the blue meet the green to give it what was going to be a subtle background, making my images be the main focus of the card. So I went ahead and removed the few masks that I did have down, and we'll move on to the Copic coloring. And I kept this pretty simple as well. Here's where I just took an EK Success journaling pen and kind of just freehanded some of those three balloon strings to meet the little bird that's holding the balloons. So I'm going to go right in with my darkest color. I'm going to be using some warm grays for the rhinos and just putting in my very darkest areas. So it'll be where he has his little head turned, so that would cast a shadow on the rest of his body, where any of his legs are behind another. And I'm just going to be doing a little bit of shading on, I don't know, would that be like a snout? I'm not sure what you call that for a rhino, but you guys know what I mean. Next, going in with the W5 and blending that W7 out a little bit, and also adding some shading in other areas that I didn't necessarily want to be as dark as the W7. So just keep in mind that all of your shadows don't necessarily need to be done with your darkest color. You can still add shadowing with your darkest midtone, or sometimes even your lightest midtone if you want a very subtle shadow. Next, I'm going to extend those areas out a little bit further with the W1 and just leaving a highlight right there in the center of his little body and off to the right hand side of each of his legs. I did leave just a little tiny bit of his little face off to the left there with none of the darkest color because I didn't want that to meet my other darkest area where his head is kind of hanging over the rest of his body. I try to avoid putting two shadows for two different objects directly next to one another. For his little horn there, I think it's called. I guess you would call that. Just going to add a little bit of shading with my C3 and my C1, but I do want this to appear white, so I'm not doing all that much shadowing there. For this next little rhino, I'm going to color him the same way as far as the color combination goes, but there's going to be different shadowing naturally because he's sitting down. So there's going to be a shadow where his face or his little chin there is hanging over his body. Also, again, where his legs are tucked behind maybe another leg or the rest of his body, and then off to the left-hand side of his face, extending those areas out with the W5. Also added a little bit of shading to the top of his head where the bird is sitting on top. That would naturally cast a shadow. For this leg out in front, I'm just adding a little bit of shading with my darkest midtone. I didn't feel that that needed to be as dark, so I skipped the W7 on that one. And again, added or left that little white piece so that it didn't have two darkest areas touching one another. Blending those areas out even further with that W3 and then finally going in with the W1 to fill the rest of those areas in. I just added just a tiny bit of shading to his ears. They're pretty tiny, so you could definitely skip that part. Did the same thing for his little horns and I don't know what those are called. I should have researched this before I did my voiceover, but the parts of his little feet there left those white as well. Added just a little bit of pink to the center of his ears and their little cheeks just to give a little bit of color. And for the balloons, I wanted these to be all different colors. Now I know the Distress ink is going to show through a little bit, and that's fine because balloons are transparent for the most part. So for the first one, I'm going to be coloring this red, and I'm going to fill in the entire area with my lightest color. And at first I was going to leave a highlight, but then just decided I'll go in with a white gel pen later. For my darkest color, I'm just adding a little bit of shading from the base of the balloon and then up the one side, but leaving a highlight all the way over. So I don't know whether you guys can see that on camera, but I didn't go all the way to the edge with my darkest color. That will basically be part of the highlight. So once the red one was done, I'm going to color the other two the same way as far as the shading goes, just use obviously different colors. So for this one will be blue, and I just left these in here so that you could see the color combinations that I used. But again, going up that right side of the balloon just to kind of leave a little bit of that highlight there. The third balloon will be a green combination, and I was going to continue on with the blue, but I just decided to color all of the balloons at the same time. The greens, I did add a little bit of darker than I normally would just because I am coloring over that Distress ink. I knew that that would kind of lighten up my colors, so just keep that in mind. Don't use too light of a highlight because it will just kind of blend in with the Distress ink background. For the little birds, I colored these kind of a I guess there's no such thing as a dark yellow, so more of an orange than a yellow, but my highlight color is a yellow. So I'm going to go in with that first and kind of map out where my darkest areas will be underneath his little wing and on his little belly there. Going in with the darkest color, just going over those areas that we mapped out, extending that out with the darkest midtone, then the lightest midtone, and then finally back to that lightest color. For the little beak, I went in with the darkest color that I used on his body, and I just colored that in solid. I didn't do any shading for that at all. And I colored the other bird pretty much the same way. The shadows will be in the same area as far as being underneath the wing, and I also added a little bit of shadow underneath where his hat is. For his hat, I'm going to be using the same reds as I did for that first balloon, just adding a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side, leaving the highlight to the right. And for this other hat, I didn't do any shading on these stripes. I just colored every other stripe, the blue and one of the greens that I used for the balloons. Now they were kind of just floating there, and I didn't necessarily want to add a shadow like I normally do. So I decided to add some blades of grass. So I didn't really like the way this came out. I wish I kind of left this out and just created that shadow, but once it's down, it's there. So I started with my lightest color and just doing very light flicks to kind of cover up my area. I extended my little flicks or blades of grass up just a little bit, but didn't put them as close together as I did towards the bottom of the card. Went in with my G03 and added more blades of grass directly underneath my little characters because naturally this area would be darker. They would cast a shadow. And went back in with that YG03, and they just weren't blending like they normally do, probably because I'm not actually coloring, I'm just flicking. So I ended up bringing in another YG marker just to kind of make those blend in a little bit better, I guess, make them flow, if that makes any sense. So I used the YG06 and extended that the G03 out and then went back with the YG03 just to add a few more blades of grass and get those colors to blend a little bit. So next I took my white gel pen and added those highlights to the little balloons and added a little bit of highlight to each of the little party hats. And for my sentiment, I'm using two of the sentiments from the stamp set. I used my grid mat there just to make sure that those were lined up before popping them on my acrylic block. Tested them out on my scrap piece of paper just to make sure that they appeared to be lined up before stamping them directly on my card with versified Onyx black ink. And I'm using some fun foam to adhere this to my card panel. I did add a little shimmer to the balloons first too. So I'm using the fun foam that has adhesive on one side, stuck that to the back of my card panel, then used my Tombow Mono multi glue to adhere that to my card base itself. Gave that a minute or two to dry, and then I took some glossy accents just to fill in the balloons. It will appear cloudy at first, but once everything is dry, you'll be able to see that highlight that we created with the white gel pen as well as that sparkle. But that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.